You think you know the Canary Islands. Sun, tourists, beach resorts with swim-up bars, and all-inclusive buffets. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've seen the ads. Maybe you picture it as a kind of permanent holiday destination. That's always been exactly what it is right now. Comfortable, familiar, warm. And that picture isn't wrong, exactly. It's just about 1,000 years too shallow. Because before the package holidays, before the Spanish flag, before the Portuguese explorers scanning the horizon, before Rome even knew these islands existed, there were people already living here. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Nobody fully understands how they got there. That's not a dramatic exaggeration. That is the actual state of the science. The Guanche, the original people of the Canary Islands, arrived on a chain of islands sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, over 60 miles from the nearest African coast, and the best evidence we have suggests they arrived with no boats capable of making the return journey. So they went in, and they never came back out, and for thousands of years, they built something remarkable in total isolation, developed distinct cultures on each separate island, mummified their dead in ways that echo ancient Egypt, raised structures that look disturbingly like step pyramids, and left behind a language that points like a compass toward a people who were themselves already ancient. By the end of this, the Guanche aren't going to be a footnote in a history you half remember from school. They're going to be proof of a migration story that quietly rewrites the Atlantic. Let's go back before the maps existed. The Canary Islands sit right at the edge of something the ancient world called the Sea of Darkness, the open Atlantic, the place beyond which, according to the stories, there was nothing. But geography has a way of making myths look stupid. These islands don't sit in the middle of nowhere. They sit at a crossroads. The Canaries are positioned directly in the path of the northeast trade winds, those great sweeping air currents that blow consistently south and westward off the coast of North Africa. Sailors in the age of exploration understood this immediately. Christopher Columbus stopped here on his way to the Americas because the winds practically push you out into the ocean from this exact point. That's the thing about the Canaries. Getting there from North Africa with the right winds is achievable. Getting back is the problem. The prevailing winds and currents that carry you toward the islands don't reverse. You can't just turn around and sail home. For ancient seafarers without the technology to beat against the wind, this wasn't a round trip. This was a one-way door. And that single geographic fact explains almost everything strange about the Guanche. Keep that in mind, because it matters for every question we're about to ask. The islands themselves are volcanic, abrupt, dramatic, carved by fire from the ocean floor. Tenerife has a peak nearly 12,000 feet high. Gran Canaria is practically a continent in miniature, with microclimates shifting from desert to cloud forest within a few miles. Lanzarote looks like the surface of another planet, all black lava fields and crater rims. These aren't gentle islands. They're pressure environments. Isolated, vertically extreme, resource-constrained in some areas, and surprisingly lush in others. A place like this doesn't just shelter a people. It shapes them. It forces adaptation, specialization, a relationship with terrain that becomes almost philosophical. And here's what's interesting. The Guanche didn't develop as one unified people across all 7 major islands. They developed separately. Each island became its own closed experiment. The same original population, fractured by water gaps they couldn't reliably cross, diverging over centuries into distinct cultures with distinct dialects, distinct social structures, distinct burial practices. Fuerteventura and Lanzarote were closest to the African coast and shared some cultural traits. Tenerife had a complex hierarchical society led by chieftains called menses. Gran Canaria developed something closer to a proto-democratic council system. La Palma had its own distinct language variant. This wasn't a primitive, undifferentiated Stone Age people camping in caves. This was a series of sophisticated human societies running parallel experiments in how to organize civilization when you can't trade, can't migrate, and can't call for help. They kept goats, sheep, and pigs. They grew barley and made a flour paste called gofio that is still eaten in the Canary Islands today, one of the most direct living threads back to the Guanche. They had oral legal traditions, class hierarchies, religious practices centered on the natural world, and they mummified their dead. That's the detail that stops most people. Mummification. Not just burying the dead, deliberately preserving them, using techniques that suggest real anatomical knowledge, placing them in volcanic caves in the dry interior of the islands where conditions helped maintain the bodies across centuries. When Spanish explorers first encountered Guanche mummies in the 1400s, they described them as tall, fair-skinned, with hair ranging from dark to reddish blonde. Now that's where the first real twist kicks in. Because the conventional picture of the Guanche, if people think about them at all, is usually something vague and prehistoric, cave people, mysterious, origin unknown. And for a long time, historians leaned into that mystery without pushing hard enough on the obvious question. If the nearest landmass is North Africa, and these people crossed water to get here, then who in North Africa were they? Here's what nobody tells you in the standard version. The language the Guanche spoke, fragmentary, reconstructed from place names, and the few words recorded by Spanish chroniclers, before the culture collapsed, contains clear echoes of Tamazight, the ancient Berber language still spoken today by the Amazigh people of Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and across the Saharan interior. We're talking about specific vocabulary, structural similarities, phonetic patterns that don't emerge by coincidence. Linguists who've studied the surviving Guanche lexicon point directly toward the Amazigh language family as the closest living relative. And when you layer the physical descriptions, the tall stature, the lighter pigmentation that appears in some Guanche populations, onto what we know about the range of physical variation within ancient Berber-speaking peoples, the picture starts resolving. The DNA doesn't match the myth of an unknowable origin. It points home. And that home is complicated in ways most people have never considered, because the Amazigh weren't just desert nomads. They were the people of North Africa before the Arab conquests, before Rome, before Carthage. Their ancestors were already ancient when the pharaohs were building pyramids. Some researchers argue the Guanche likely descended from a population that crossed from the North African coast sometime in the first millennium BCE, possibly earlier, though the exact date remains debated. Some historians argue for a Phoenician connection. Others point more directly to indigenous Berber groups. Either way, the directional arrow is consistent. These people came from the Atlantic fringe of North Africa. They made a one-way crossing, and they brought with them a culture that retained traces of its mainland origins, even as it evolved in total isolation for centuries. But now, watch what happens when you ask the next obvious question. If they could get to the islands, why didn't they maintain contact? Why didn't more people follow? Why did the Guanche apparently lose the ability, or the knowledge, to build ocean-going vessels entirely? Here's where the geography does something almost cruel. Once the original settlers arrived, the conditions that preserved their culture also sealed their fate. The islands had limited timber suitable for large vessel construction. The return voyage was essentially impossible given their technology. Within a generation or two, the people who might have remembered how to build the boats that brought them were gone. The knowledge decayed. What remained was the island itself and the need to survive on it. Over time, the Guanche became something unprecedented. A Stone Age culture maintained not by technological regression, but by geographic necessity, in a place where the ocean was simultaneously their origin and their prison. No metal, No contact with the mainland 60 miles away. Each island a sealed world. This is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary natural experiments in human cultural isolation in the ancient world. And then Spain arrived. The conquest of the Canary Islands is one of the longer, bloodier, and more underreported colonial campaigns in European history. It began in the early 1400s and wasn't completed until 1496, nearly a century of resistance. Let that sit for a moment. A Stone Age people, fighting with wooden spears and stone projectiles and intimate knowledge of their terrain, held off one of the most powerful military machines in Europe for roughly 100 years. The Guanche of Tenerife defeated multiple Spanish expeditions. The people of Gran Canaria built fortified positions and used guerrilla tactics in the ravines and volcanic landscape to neutralize Spanish technological advantages. The island of La Palma saw fierce resistance. It was ultimately disease, the invisible weapon no military strategy could counter, that broke the Guanche, not direct military conquest alone. Gran Canaria fell largely because epidemics had decimated the population before the final campaigns. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because the standard version of this story usually treats the Guanche as a passive footnote, a people who simply disappeared when Europeans showed up. That version is wrong on two counts. First, they fought hard for a century. Second, they didn't disappear. And that's the loop we've been holding open since the beginning. If the Guanche were effectively destroyed by conquest and disease, why does their DNA keep showing up in the modern Canarian population? The answer lands in the genetics. And when you look at it through a detective's lens rather than a biology textbook, it tells you something profound about how conquest actually works at the level of bodies and bloodlines. Here's the setup. Genetic researchers analyzing the ancestry of modern Canary Islanders, people living on these islands today, find a striking pattern when they separate the evidence by biological line of inheritance. Your mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child, essentially unchanged, across generations. It traces the maternal line. Your Y chromosome DNA passes from father to son. It traces the paternal line. These two streams of inheritance tell different stories, and in the Canary Islands, those stories are almost opposite. Research into mitochondrial DNA, the maternal inheritance, finds substantial Guanche ancestry surviving in the modern population. Analyses indicate that a significant proportion of modern Canarians carry maternal lineages that trace directly to the pre-conquest indigenous population. The women, in other words, survived. Not unharmed, not as a free people, but biologically continuous. Their genetic thread runs forward into today. The paternal story is almost the mirror image. Y chromosome analysis of modern Canarians shows a population that is overwhelmingly European in its male lineage. The Guanche men, it appears, were killed, displaced, or died in such numbers during and after the conquest that their paternal genetic contribution to the modern population is relatively small. This asymmetry is not an accident, and it's not unique to the Canaries. It's a pattern that appears in colonial genetic signatures around the world, from the Americas to parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Conquest, historically, kills men and absorbs women. The women carried the memory forward in their DNA. That's not a metaphor. That's what the evidence implies. But the maternal genetic signal does something else that matters. It connects modern Canarians not just to the Guanche as an island people, but to specific ancient populations on the North African mainland. Genetic analyses have found patterns consistent with deep ancestral ties to ancient Amazigh and pre-Amazigh North African populations, groups that themselves carry lineages diverging from broader African populations tens of thousands of years ago, well before the Sahara dried out and reshaped the entire human geography of the continent. And this is where the story blows open in a direction most people have never considered. The Amazigh are not a secondary character in this story. They're the bridge to something much older and much larger. Here's what nobody tells you about North Africa around 5 to 10,000 years ago. It was green. The Sahara, which we now think of as the defining barrier of the continent, the great divide between Mediterranean North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, was not always a desert. In a period climatologists call the Green Sahara, or the African Humid Period, the entire Saharan region was covered in grasslands, lakes, rivers, and forests. People moved across it freely. Populations that are now genetically separated by thousands of miles of desert were once connected by continuous habitable land. Rock art across the Central Sahara, cattle, hippos, people swimming, records a world that no longer exists. And then, roughly 5 to 6,000 years ago, the climate shifted. The monsoons retreated. The lakes dried. The grass died. The Sahara expanded across an area the size of the continental United States in a geological eye blink. And the people who had been living in that green interior were pushed north toward the Mediterranean coast, east toward the Nile Valley, west toward the Atlantic fringe. Some, genetic analyses suggest, may have been pushed all the way to the coast, and eventually, in a movement that research indicates is consistent with what we see in Guanche ancestry, across the water to islands that the trade winds were pulling them toward anyway. The Green Sahara collapse didn't just change geography, it seeded the Atlantic. It planted the Guanche. And that's not even the strangest part, because this means the Guanche weren't just an isolated island curiosity. They were, in a very real sense, a living archive of a North African world that the Sahara erased. Their language, their genetics, their mummification practices, all of it preserves echoes of a continental culture that was dispersed and partially buried under sand thousands of years before Spain ever showed up with cannons. The mummies in particular are worth pausing on. The Guanche mummification tradition, evisceration, drying, wrapping in animal skins, shows technical sophistication that didn't emerge from nowhere. It suggests knowledge passed down through generations, a reverence for the preserved body that has parallels across North Africa and even in ancient Egypt, though the exact relationship is debated. Some researchers point to the similarities cautiously, acknowledging that parallel development is possible. Others see the connections as too specific to dismiss. Either way, the pattern is clear. You don't develop a complex mummification tradition in isolation without some ancestral basis for it. And the Guanche had it. Hidden in caves in the volcanic highlands, sealed away by dry air and darkness, some of those mummies survived long enough to be studied by modern scientists, long enough to give up their DNA and confirm, across thousands of years of silence, who these people actually were and where they actually came from. Now here's the duality that sits at the heart of this whole story, and it's the part that resists easy framing. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands was brutal. It involved enslavement, forced conversion, cultural erasure. The Guanche language was suppressed. The oral traditions were lost. The social structures were dismantled. The mummies were disturbed, studied, sold, scattered across European collections. By the 1600s, the Guanche as a distinct cultural people had effectively ceased to exist as a living civilization. That is true. And also true, within a generation of the conquest, intermarriage between Spanish settlers and surviving Guanche women was not just common. It was the dominant demographic reality. The conquerors absorbed the people they were supposed to have erased. The genetic record is unambiguous on this. Modern Canarians are not simply Spanish. They carry a layer of ancestry that predates Spain, predates Rome, predates written history on these islands. An ancestry that runs back through the Atlantic crossing, through the North African coast, through the Green Sahara, and into a deep, human past that the tourist brochures never mention. The colonizers thought they were replacing a people. What they actually did was fold them into their own bloodline and call it something else. The islands that swallowed their own history did it quietly, in the bodies of every person born there for the last 5 centuries. So let's return to the image we started with. Sun, tourists, beach resorts. That picture is still true. But underneath every resort on Tenerife, underneath the poolside cocktails and the volcanic black sand beaches, this story is still running. The trade winds that carry charter flights into Gran Canaria today are the same winds that carried the first boats west from North Africa thousands of years ago. The gofio that Canarian grandmothers still make is the same barley paste the Guanche were eating before the Spanish arrived. The mitochondrial DNA in the cells of a woman born in Las Palmas today may carry an unbroken line back to a woman who watched the first Spanish ships appear on the horizon and did not fully understand what was coming. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. The Guanche story is not a mystery about a lost people. It is a lesson about how origin stories actually work. They are never clean. They are never simple. They are layers, geography forcing movement, climate erasing worlds and birthing new ones, migration carrying knowledge across impossible distances, conquest destroying cultures while simultaneously absorbing them, genetics preserving in silence what history tried to erase in noise. Every people on Earth has a version of this story. The Guanche version just happens to be unusually vivid, unusually well preserved in the volcanic caves and the ancient DNA and the linguistic fossils, and unusually ignored by everyone who should be telling it louder. The forgotten Atlantic frontier was never as empty as the map suggested, and the people who lived there were never as lost as the history books implied. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. Did you know the Guanche were never fully erased? That their ancestry is still alive in the people of the Canary Islands today? Because most people do not. And if this story surprised you, wait until the next one, because the Amazigh themselves, the people the Guanche descended from, have an origin story just as strange, just as buried, and just as far-reaching as everything we just uncovered here.